is Don Santa. I'm the President and CEO of the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. And we have a very distinguished panel to talk about the question of the long-term outlook, the pipeline system of 2030. Before introducing the panel, let me set the stage for you. I think the United States has got an energy pipeline network that is the envy of the world. We've got about 2.6 million miles of energy pipeline, about 2.1 million miles of gas distribution system, about 300,000 miles of natural gas transmission, about 190,000 miles of various forms of liquid petroleum pipelines. And it's this pipeline system that really makes it possible for us to enjoy the benefits of our energy abundance. It's that which gets this energy to consumers, gets it to industry. As you know, increasingly for natural gas, there's the relationship with electric power generation, where gas has done so much. So clearly this is a big part of our energy infrastructure and provides tremendous benefits to our nation. It is a huge advantage. By the same token, pipelines have become controversial. In many cases, due to our energy abundance and where that energy is located, pipes are being built in areas where, at least in recent history, there hasn't been much energy infrastructure construction. That certainly creates issues for landowners and communities. Also, we've got the fact that all of this is against the backdrop of the bigger energy debate that I know has been talked a lot about today in terms of our transition to a cleaner energy economy. And where does natural gas, where does pipeline infrastructure, where does energy infrastructure fit within that context? So clearly there are lots of it's an interesting time for the pipeline industry in terms of both the opportunities and the challenges that we face. We've got a great panel here with us this morning to talk about that, and I'll start immediately to my left. We've got the Honorable Alex Hergott, who is the Executive Director of the administration's Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. Next to Alex, we've got Mike Catanzaro, who is the President and Chief Policy Officer of the CGCN Group. Next to Mike, we've got Richard Averett, who's from Nelson County, Virginia. He is an entrepreneur, businessman, and probably most important relative to this conversation, a landowner. Next to Richard, we've got Joe Blum. Joe is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Colonial Pipeline. Next to Joe, we've got Karen Harbert, who is the President and CEO of the American Gas Association. Next to Karen, we've got Stan Horton, who's the President and CEO of Boardwalk Pipeline Partners. And then finally, but not least, we have got Dina Wiggins, who is the President and CEO of the Natural Gas Supply Association. So let me start out with this question for the panel. To what extent will the nation's energy pipeline network, that is natural gas, crude oil, refined product, and NGLs, look different in 2030? How might it be configured differently? How might it be utilized differently? Let me start with Stan Horton on that, since Stan has seen a lot in terms of the pipeline industry, in terms of the evolution of from shortage to surplus to shortage back to surplus, the role that pipes have played. So Stan, why don't you give us your perspective on that, and then we'll work our way through the panel.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I wrote down just a couple of things that pipelines are facing today that maybe in my career we haven't faced before. We've got the grid resiliency that you heard today that would take away some natural gas demand. We've got the renewable mandates that are sitting out there. We've got judicial attacks on eminent domain, whether pipelines can actually condemn state land. We've got a ban on fracking that's been proposed by a couple of the Democratic candidates. And we've got a Senate bill that says it can't build compressor stations if the natural gas is going to be used for export. So those are just some of the things that we've got to overcome if we're going to continue to build pipelines in this country. And I think we will. And the reason I think we will is because we have an abundance of supply that needs to get into a market, both a domestic market that's growing and an international market that's growing. I looked at some statistics the other day of just the LNG market, and And with the first round of build-outs that we're having, I think that's about 10 BCF a day. I think there's about 5 BCF a day that of new exports that have been already FID'd, and I think there's 10 to 11 on the next wave that people are marking that are profitable. Those pretty close numbers, man?
Pretty good.
I mean, she's the expert. So when you look at that, and you look at where the Gulf Coast is supply short. We need more pipelines coming from the Permian to fill that shortage. We need more pipelines coming from the Haynesville to meet that shortage. So I think you're going to see continuous build-outs. You also look at some of the pipelines that are being built today. I saw some stats the other day that on some large pipeline projects, the costs range from anywhere from $3 million a pipeline mile to the most expensive one, which I think was Mountain Valley, was up to about $15 million a pipeline mile. So it's getting more and more risky to build these large diameter pipelines. I don't care whether they're gas pipelines or crude pipelines or liquid pipelines. So I think the infrastructure is going to continue to be built out. I think the world needs additional natural gas. The exports of crude are good, but we certainly have some political win against us, right now that we've got to overcome.
Thanks, Dan. Stan talked about the supply push. Dina, do you want to address it from the AGSA perspective?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You mentioned the abundant supply picture, and I think it's worth pausing on that for a moment because that really is, to me, the underlying reason why we need this pipeline infrastructure. We now have 3,300 TCF of gas in the ground. And I think it's really important to put that in perspective. In 1966, that number was 690 TCF in the ground. That was recoverable reserves. That number has shot up in large part because of the shale revolution. And I think it's also important to note that it's not a static number. The history shows us that our producers are getting better and better and better at producing that gas that's in the ground. This winter, we are expected to reach record production of 92 BCF a day. That's unprecedented. And again, we don't think that is going to stop at 92 BCF a day, again, because of the technological innovation. Going forward, we need this pipeline infrastructure to get the gas to market. I also think that going forward in this whole conversation that we're having both nationally and internationally about a cleaner energy future, that gas is poised to be a partner to renewables to reach some of these lower targets that some of the states are putting in place.
Karen, AGA represents the gas distribution companies, and so your members have got a direct connection with the homeowners and businesses who utilize natural gas. Can you talk about it from your perspective?
And so Dina supplies it, you move it, and we use it. So as we're customer facing, I'm the energy optimist, always at the table, because as we look at what's changing out in the marketplace, yes, we have a lot more of it, but we're also using a lot more of it, but we're using it much more efficiently at the same time, which is a good story. So this year alone, we've added 525,000 new customers for natural gas in homes and businesses and industrial facilities. So 178 million Americans every day consume natural gas. That's more people, to put a political point on it, than voted for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton combined. So we've got a big political party out there for natural gas. Couldn't help myself. But more importantly, as we look at adding a new customer every minute, at the same time we're matching that with investments in safety and efficiency. This industry, like no other, is so focused on making sure that their product is delivered safely and reliably. So this year alone, the distribution companies have invested $20 billion in improving safety and about $1.5 billion in energy efficiency. And what that means is we're replacing the pipe that was put in place like right after World War II to be safe so that it doesn't have any leaks, it doesn't have any problems, and can deliver gas very safely. So that's a long way around of saying we get the fact that we have to earn our right for social license to operate every day. And we're making good on that by making our system safer, making it more efficient, making it tighter, and delivering it 24/7, whether it's a polar vortex in the winter or whether it's extreme heat in the summer. Natural gas is always there, which is why there's a point of contention, I think, a little bit with our electric utilities who have a push to electrify everything. And there are places where that makes sense, but there's lots of places where it doesn't make sense too.
Great, thank you. Joe, could you add the liquid pipeline perspective?
Sure. I was trying to think of what Neil said this morning, how to make a bold statement here in the forum. I think, from a liquid pipeline perspective, we have a very strong future. When I thought about 2030, I kind of looked at it a different way and thought about, what would displace a colonial pipeline system where we have 40% of the market share going into the Northeast states. We carry jet fuel, we carry gasolines, various grades of gasolines, we carry diesel, we carry heating oil. And I think, as I think about 2030, our future is strong, even with our customers, and a large majority of our customers are the Gulf Coast refiners, who over the course of the last 3 or 4 years have expanded their capacity at the refinery level by 20 to 30%, now fueling the exports, rise in the exports that we see throughout the industry. The other thing I thought about when I thought about 2030 is the continual investment that we have to make, even though we continue to be the lowest cost provider of transport of these products. We are the safest form of transport and the most secure form. But, things that came up this morning in our discussion are very true to all of us in the pipeline business now, is the investment in cybersecurity and the need to do that. The investment in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and the need to do that, continue to stay competitive and efficient in the marketplace. So, a strong future ahead of us. Not a lot of displacement by 2030. A lot of people always come to us and go, what about your gasoline movements? Are you going to lose that to electric cars? We have to remember, again, only about 2% of all car sales in the U.S. today are electric. And even if you go out to 2030, it's still a pretty insignificant number. So, strong future.
Great, thanks, Joe. Richard, could you share with us the landowner perspective on the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a strong question, and I'm mostly going to reflect on natural gas pipelines, not as much the liquid products, but I think there's a strong question, given what Bob said this morning, whether or not we'll be building any new nat gas pipelines by 2030. But let's presume for now that we are, and that between here and now, from a landowner perspective, there are at least 3 really important things that have to be addressed in order to do it responsibly and with respect for communities. The first of those is environmental injustice and environmental racism. And the fact is, as you look around the room in here and downstairs today, I couldn't count more than about a half a dozen folks of color in the room. And it's not, I don't think they were excluded. I think they're not in the industry at all. And I think that that has to be recognized, because in the natural gas environment, for sure, these pipelines disproportionately impact those communities all the time. And their voice needs to be at the table in order to build any coalition and show respect for them. Secondly, on the issue of eminent domain, I think there's a very serious question about whether eminent domain should ever be used to produce a for-profit export product. I think that's inconsistent with our beliefs around property rights. But particularly when you look at how the courts have extended the right to eminent domain to include preliminary injunctions or quick take, that collapses on landowners to be an absolute destruction of your right to due process. The very first letter I got from the Atlantic Coast Pipeline about two properties that I own, a business property and my family homestead, said they would come to our property for a pre-condemnation survey to evaluate whether or not they wanted to use our property for an infrastructure project. And if we didn't sign the letter giving them authorization to come, they would take us to court and enforce their right to do that. That's not working with citizens. That is not coming out and saying, hey, we've got a project we need to build, let's work together. And because the courts have given them the right to quick take, a landowner who cares about any issue in the easement conditions other than price, they care about the location. Hey, we need to move this away from Grandpa's grave under that old oak tree. We need to move it aside from where I want to build a daughter's house when she gets a little older. Any of those things, you must go and negotiate in advance. Because once the pipeline company gets quick take, you have no power at the table. They're going to build whatever was on that plat. And so the idea that eminent domain is only used as a last resort is a false narrative from a landowner perspective. It is used in every pipeline case if it's on the table. Because when you sit down at the negotiating table, one of the two parties can walk away with virtually no negative impact. And the other one loses everything they care about. And that's really important to acknowledge. And the last part of this, which is adjacent to that, is conditional permits from FERC. And it makes total sense to me how we ended up with conditional permits. For projects that are this big, there are a bazillion small permits, permits both big and large. But there are a handful of permits that are foundational to the execution of the project. You know, your endangered species permits, your water quality or 401 certs, your national parks and permits, etc. And to enable the taking of land, private citizens' land, and the destruction of that land at a time when those permits are still in question is really unconscionable. We end up with situations like the Hallorans in Pennsylvania, where the pipeline company, in that case I think it's Mariner 2, asked for a preliminary injunction or quick take. They received it. They waited 2 years to come cut the trees. Then they cut them all down, and ultimately they were denied the water quality permit. And so that pipeline is likely never to be built. But their sugar maple farm is decimated, and they have no recourse and will likely never get compensation of any kind. That's not an appropriate due process. So,
Can I answer this one? if you don't mind?
Sure, Alex.
This is a spirited debate, because I think it's a bit unfair to cast a characterization that those that are developing natural gas and pipelines in this country are somehow nefarious or calculative actors. And I can tell you firsthand, in Oregon, one of the highest and most stringent water quality states that we have, on the Jordan Cove project, with 600 miles of pipeline, working directly not only with the governor and the local stakeholders and the rest, clearing 75-foot right-of-way through old growth doesn't decimate entities. The easements and the mitigation, the compensatory mitigation that many of the folks in this room are engaging in cast a much better picture, and it's not the exception, it is the rule, that many of these pipelines that are going to get built are very similar to 1956 when we did the interstate system. 44,000 miles of national prerogative was built for profit companies to get their goods to market to sell at ports, and they benefit from a similar idea. There is a balance, and I'd just say, how many know what the Federal Permitting Council is? We have one-pagers over there for but you know, in my time at CEQ, developing the One Federal Decision Executive Order, and now with this statutorily created council that was passed by more than 90 votes in the U.S. Senate and more than like 350 in the House in 2015, what it does is it has the clarity of having 12 deputy secretaries and an executive director, which is me, my team, that provides unprecedented clarity and transparency for all stakeholders, giving the pipeline folks what they need, which is predictability in the market to reduce risk, and then bringing all relevant stakeholders to the table to address issues on the front end. And that is now being done in a way that has not been done in previous administrations. And so although there are serious questions about fair market value and the equitable nature of eminent domain and the rest, the bottom line is the pipelines are going to get built. The question is how we do them. And the way in which the council interjects with our $9 million budget, which is 3 times the size of CEQ, and our 50 staff, and having one representative from each federal agency and state and local, and why we were received so well by the environmental groups in Oregon is because we now have a history with Venture Global and Gulfport LNG and our work, what we're doing on ACP and MVP, independent of the judicial review questions, is ensuring that the predictability and transparency isn't just for the federal agencies and the project proponents, but also for the locals, including the low and disparate impacted communities and the tribal members, which is really what the goal of the council is and why the administration's put some support behind it.
And finally, we've got Mike. Did you bring it home for us?
Let's go a little different direction. I want to go back to what Stan said and what Karen said. You know, first of all, I share with Karen sort of optimism about the future, particularly with the energy industry. The energy industry in this country is incredible. I think, particularly the natural gas industry, has done a lot to innovate and grow in years. I think there's a lot to be gained from that in the future. So, but then what Stan was saying, I'm very, very concerned about as a policymaker, someone who's been in government for a long time, about the policy environment. Particularly, I think about New York and what's going on there. I'm very concerned looking at Governor Cuomo in the state of New York has passed a very ambitious climate law, and I think he feels compelled that as part of that he needs to say no to natural gas pipelines. And so we did see an instance where I think it was Con Ed said, well, we're going to have to stop basically hooking up gas to homes and businesses because we can't get it there. And so that obviously raised significant concerns. And now Cuomo is just coming in and saying, well, I'm going to force you to do these hookups. And that's very problematic as well. And so even, I think with the administration, what they're doing and with the impending election is going to bring potentially fracking bans and all the rest. If Congress doesn't step up and fix the permitting process, I think we're in big trouble. Because again, even with the administration trying to do a lot of good things on the NEPA front, the Endangered Species Act, trying to do one federal decision for everything will have a smart, rational thing. That's not, I mean, basically the policy environment is such that it's biased in favor of those who don't want to build things. So what happens is, with all sorts of pipelines we're dealing with now, whether it's ECP or MVP, you go to court, you go to the court circuit, or you go to the DC circuit, and whether it's your greenhouse gas analysis that you're doing, or whether it's figuring out whether you have a threatened endangered species along the way, courts are going to have a say. And what we're finding is that they're remanding back to the agencies, they're vacating decisions, you have to go and you have to start all over again. And even if there's a second-term Trump administration and these reforms are finalized and carried out, then again, we're still going to have this cycle of you finalize a regulation and you go to court and you're not sure where you're going to end up. And Congress, again, if they don't step up and try to reform statutes that have been in the books for nearly 4 decades and have not been adapted to the new policy or the new energy landscape that we're in, we're going to continue to face these problems. I do think these pipelines, as Alex said, are going to get built. That's really not the question. It's just at what level of pain and cost and delay and frustration are you going to have to go
Who
through?
bears that cost?
Correct. I think consumers ultimately will bear it.
Right.
So, anyway.
Well, we've got some follow-up questions and kind of riff on this. I think I'd prefer to open it up to all of you and see what questions you may have. What I would ask is that if someone has a question, please identify yourself and who you're with, just so we have some context. But would anybody like to put a question to the panel? Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Tom Popick. I'm from the Foundation for Resilient Societies. We're concerned about the security of the natural gas system after a wide area cascading collapse of the electric grid. And I'm hoping some of the people from the natural gas industry can talk about, if there were no electric supply to your pipelines, could they continually, reliably continue to supply natural gas for electric generation?
Yeah, I'll be glad to answer that. At every one of our compressor stations where we have some purchase power, we have natural gas backup in the event that the purchase power is not there. So you can start and stop compressor stations. All the auxiliary equipment can run on the emergency generation that we have at every one of our stations. In fact, we're also looking at one of our stations right here in Kentucky. It's our Hanson compressor station, of actually installing solar panels to offset some of the purchase power that we have at that plant. And if it works, we may do that at other compressor stations along our system. But there is backup power at each one of our compressor stations.
If I could have a short follow-up, the concept of continuing to nominate natural gas for transmission into a blackout area, are there any legal concerns about liability regarding that? In other words, even if there's the technical capability to continue to transmit natural gas into an area where there is not reliable communications, are gas pipeline companies still willing to do that?
You know, every molecule that moves through that pipeline has to be scheduled and confirmed by someone. There has to be a communication protocol all the way back to the producer and all the way to the end user. If you don't have that communication protocol, then gas doesn't get scheduled, pure and simple. But there is a, it's a regulatory mandated scheduling of pipeline, gas that's there. So if you were in a total blackout area and there was no communication and you couldn't nominate and schedule gas, there wouldn't be deliveries into that particular area.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions from the you out there? Okay, in the front row?
Yeah, so maybe I can, Michael Polsky, with the IPP developer using a lot of nature gas, but I just want to kind of give you a little observation here that obviously there is an issue of building pipelines. Before we had easier time because really there were not that many options in natural gas. Now with renewables, with electric vehicles, I mean there are options available in the market, and that's basically slows down because it's no longer kind of people look as a critical infrastructure that must build. If you don't build, we kind of run out of heat or run out of driving. What do you guys think? I mean, as other options proliferates, really the need is not there as used to be before. So this is just a reality check, so to speak.
Well, I might take a stab at a couple of thoughts there. First of all,
Let me paraphrase your question. The question came from Michael Polsky with Invergy, an IPP developer. And his question was that, well, at one point in time, to paraphrase, gas was kind of the only option. Now you've got between renewables, electric vehicles, whatever, other options. To what degree does that change your perspective on these things? Did I catch it?
On ability to increase gas infrastructure.
Okay, yep.
So just a couple of thoughts. People want it. They want to be able to cook with it in their homes. They want to be able to heat their homes. They want a fireplace in their home, a natural gas fireplace. You know, if you didn't have a natural gas fireplace in Colorado, we'd have to cancel après-ski, right? So, you know, people want it. We're adding, you know, a customer every minute of every day. They're not doing that because they don't have other choices. They're doing this. They want that choice. The other part of this puzzle where you're seeing the big increase in demand is twofold. Industrial demand. I mean, we're seeing a huge advanced manufacturing resurgence in this country. They don't have a substitute for natural gas. It is a feedstock into their process. So the demand pull and the growth in industrial capacity is there. And then, of course, there's the export side of things that was previously talked about.
And that's a big thing. I mean, keep in mind that more than 70 bipartisan representatives of the U.S. Senate authorized legislation to export oil 4 years ago. The recognition from your perspective, Michael, who I've been watching for quite some time, is that you're looking at it from a consumer perspective. In Oregon, just for an example, and I use that because it's a very, very difficult project that folks didn't think was going to get built. The counties that pipeline traverses are the poorest counties in Oregon and all of the West Coast. Timber industry collapsed. The LNG export facility, the stations there within, are going to completely revitalize and change the dynamic nature of what's happening in those areas. So it's not just about what's happening with other renewables, because my 600 megawatt Gemini solar plant and my offshore wind, where I'll be with Tom tomorrow in Boston, the same thing, all have the systemic issues of NIMBYism, and those that have a disconnect between what a kilowatt per hour is and how we actually get there. And so I think that's a significant issue.
I also think there's an economic issue. I mean, the U.S. Chamber did some work on what it's costing residential consumers in the Northeast, because we are having difficulty getting gas up there because it's difficult to site the pipelines because we can't manage to get through the state of New York. And the U.S. Chamber's conclusion was that residential electricity consumers in the Northeast are paying about 44% more than the national average, and it really is because of our difficulty in getting gas and to serve that market. So I think that part of the conversation needs to be, everyone needs energy. How are we going to supply it? And there's a changing fuel mix. I understand that, but I think that natural gas is an important part, even in a changing fuel mix environment.
We had a question in the front row, one against the window, and then I think we've got one in the second row here, just to people north. So, Darren?
So, Darren McDonald, I'm with Gerdau. We're a steel manufacturer. One of the challenges that we're seeing as a large industrial end user, not at all of our locations, but at some of our locations in the U.S., is the availability of pipeline capacity. Although we're saying pipelines getting built, we're being interrupted more frequently. We're having trouble getting capacity. We're paying a lot more for whatever capacity we get, and that is a direct cause of delays in pipelines being built. Of course, we have the demand from industrial and exports and power gen, and all of these things are being approved, but nothing's being done to get the infrastructure to keep up. And that's the biggest fear that we have, is that, you know, there might be in general increasing amounts of capacity, but there's pockets where it's a problem, and we're being sacrificed to support even exports, domestic manufacturing. So we need to figure out how we're going to fix that, because I don't think that's the intent, but that's a reality.
Okay, for those in the back who may not have heard the question, in fact, it was Darren's with a steel manufacturer, noted difficulties of getting pipeline capacity, cost of it increasing, interruptions, and then noted that demand is increasing, but it appears that the ability to build infrastructure to keep up with it, the delays, have a cost.
I mean, where can you say are you experiencing these delays and other things? What part of
Virginia, North Carolina.
Okay.
I'd love to speak to that for just a minute and make a couple of comments. Darren and I had a great talk yesterday, and I as a capitalist entrepreneur, I fully empathize with that problem. And yet, that problem is a problem driven by profit motives for private industry. And I think that it is not the appropriate policy approach to take citizens' land that is either within business entities or private homesteads and family farms, so that the steel mill can have the gas that it needs, if that is done outside of the free market. So the use of eminent domain in that construct is inappropriate. And the fact that we have a shortage is as much driven by the fact that we are exporting a huge amount of natural gas outside of the country than it is that we don't have enough gas available. And so, and Alex, I want to comment. I did not state that the actors who build pipelines are nefarious. But I pulled up the INGAA commitments to landowners, and I can tell you that this document is not what happens on the ground for landowners. And so, I can't judge intent from the pipeline builders. What I can judge is the impact in my community, in the communities around the MVP, and the other pipeline folks who I'm talking about. And in terms of decimating, in the particular case I was talking about, the Hallorans owned a sugar maple farm. And the pipeline cut down 500 sugar maple trees to put in the pipeline. That is clearly decimating that family business. There's just no way around that. And that, to me, is taking from one business to give to another business. And that's problematic. We have to address that from a landowner perspective.
And I agree, but we can't have the debate with the extremes. The reality is that our number one export by volume in this country is cardboard and paper. What's actually producing the GDP? These companies and the rest that are building these facilities and the bipartisan recognition that oil and LNG exports are a way in which we can harness our energy revolution, and then we can build back a base of export in this country that will allow for the economic disparity across that you referenced. That's where we get the inputs, the economic inputs. So there has to be a balance, right? We can't have a situation where the debt and equity cost of pipelines is 14%, where it used to be 6%, because the regulatory uncertainty and the fact that it's sue and settle, and the fact that judges are making science-based decisions on pipelines are creating an adversarial world in which pipelines are pitted against the regulators and pitted against the stakeholders. That doesn't need to be that way, but that's been the narrative. And so we have to be very clear about striking the balance.
I just want to make one comment about the export issue that was embedded in part of that conversation. Yes, it's true that exports of natural gas, LNG, are rising. But I think Stan, Meg, it's like 8 BCF, somewhere in that range, 8 BCF a day. That is still a fairly small percentage of what we're using in this country every day. So I don't think that if we're going to have a conversation about building pipelines and all, I don't think that looking at that very small percentage and blaming, if you will, the LNG exporters on any of these other difficulties is appropriate.
So we've got, 3 more questions. We're running short on time. It's going to kind of go to a lightning.
We got time.
4 lightning round here. But anyway, we've got the gentleman against the window.
So I am a native Oregonian, born and raised. I live in rural Oregon. I am an affected landowner, so I do realize I have my argument before the commission, so be careful with that. But in Oregon, we did do polling on LNG exports and pipelines in all 5 districts. In the most conservative parts of the state, mostly Republican, took issue with exporting gas and property rights. So I guess my question to you is, do you, and I know Coos Bay, I grew up crabbing and fishing, I know those people. Even in that particular town, it's about 50-50. And we've been around for 15 years without ever having a precedent agreement for offtake. We think that's too long. We think local people should be listened to as well. So just to ask you to respond.
Sure, no, and obviously it's a very complicated project, and that's why the governor of Oregon is on the fence and hasn't come out against it. Ultimately, the 401 will lead her decisional document, but the bottom line is this. There were two different stories on that project. There was the first iteration with Williams and the rest, and then there's with different alignments that were far more complicated and did some, and then there's the new alignment in which they've already locked up 98% of the landowners. And although individuals that have the signs out that say no LNG, it's not about the nature of how they were affected as landowners. It's about a philosophical opposition to carbon-based exports. That's a different policy position. For me, I have Clydesdale blinders on. The process is the process is the process. And as long as it's followed based on what the law explicitly states and with the delegated authorities of the states, with the Clean Water Act obligations, it's important to recognize that those decisions in that forum needs to happen, obviously, but that project that's happening now.
I know, I appreciate that comment, and I agree with that. I think the state is doing a great job in the regulation for it. But I do say those numbers on private landowners, we're in contact with every landowner.
Yep.
So we have our numbers, and they're different from your numbers, so we're just not.
Well, there's two different alignments. There's a FERC preferred, and then there's a company preferred, and both of them have debates and drawbacks, right?
Of course, but we need to have more dialogue because we're wide apart.
Well, my card's over there.
Okay.
We've got the lady in the second row.
Yes, I represent a former natural gas producer, but I'm at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. My question is on state versus federal rights, specifically with the New York case. What does one do about this? Does it require congressional legislation? I mean, how does one address this issue?
The question for the back was about state versus federal rights, in particular pointing to what's going on in the state of New York in terms of the cases there, and what do you do about the state versus federal questions?
If I may, Mike and I struggled with this at the White House quite a bit. But the deal is, cooperative federalism will work. You can't usurp the innate rights that states have and the delegated authorities and the unique nature of the way in which they, based on the law, are comporting requirements under the Clean Water Act with the unique nature of the state. What we can't have is individuals using these delegated authorities as rhetorical tools to object to projects, not on the basis of the Clean Water Act, but using a tool. And that has happened, right? And that is the regulatory risk that I talked about that is driving up the uncertainty of whether or not inducing additional investment in pipelines to address capacity. There is a balance. There's a balance. And what it takes is early stakeholder engagement on the front end, where the state is a voluntary cooperative entity on the front end, and the roles and responsibilities and the requirements there within are established on the front end, not on the back end, where they have 60 days to review a permit and have no choice to deny it, or in many cases with Millennium Bulk Terminal, deny it with prejudice based on policy grounds. You can't have that. So you can either write a law that usurps cooperative federalism, which is not ideal, and which likely would never pass in the House or the Senate, or we can adjust our regulations and our handbooks in the way in which we coordinate the states on a delegated authority, which up until recently was working perfectly until it was used as a tool to object to natural gas markets.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's been worked. I don't think it worked perfectly, but it certainly worked to an extent. But I mean, I was exactly right about the 401 issue. I mean, I think that certain states have been very clever in looking at that law and figuring out how to use it to block gas infrastructure in the case of New York. And I think the EPA did a good job of going back and saying this is the actual intent of what 401 is supposed to do. You're supposed to look at water quality concerns, and I think states like New York, Washington State, and others are going way beyond bounds. EPA is trying to set that right again, but as I said before, they're going to get sued on that policy. And so I think eventually this could find its way to the Supreme Court, but that could be years from now. And it'll depend on administration about what their posture will be and how they're going to fight that case. So to your extent, the question, how do you fix it? It has to be Congress. I sound naive when I say it, because people say Congress will never do it. But again, we have this misalignment in our system right now, where you have statutes that are governing the permitting process that were passed in the 1970s. And they haven't caught up with the fact that we're undergoing a shale gas revolution in this country. And we have to fix that. And so if we continue to do it in this ad hoc way, and there's this shift from administration to administration, one does reform, the other sort of swings it back, and then you all go to court and try to figure it out. First of all, it's terribly anti-democratic, because you have people who are unelected in bureaucracies writing rules, and then you go to courts, and you have judges who are also unelected, and then Congress, which is where you're supposed to have accountability, does nothing.
And there's two issues, by the way. There's the criteria of the 401, and then there's the timing a la Constitution. Those both have to get handled separately and exclusively from each other.
Comments are due today. Comments are due today.
So just 2 sentences on the impact, because there's real impacts to this, not just to your industrial facility, but in the case of New York, with the utility being forced to say, I cannot now hook up any new customers. That means to your home, to your business. So business owners that were banking on a natural gas-fired oven for their new pizza shop had to go back and repay the loan and go somewhere else. Those 1,100 customers that they were just mandated to turn on by the governor, you know how they're going to fix that? Is they're going to turn on those 1,123 customers. They're going to cut back their supply to their industrial customers. And what are the industrial customers gonna do? Either pay more, so we pay more, or they're going to do what they are gonna do, which is they're gonna burn oil instead, and their emissions are gonna go up. So under the guise of environmental objections to natural gas, we're gonna cause the emissions in New York City to go up.
I've been told we're on such a roll here, they've given us an extra 15 minutes, so. There you go. That's not fair, but I'm gonna let y'all choose your own adventure. Toby next.
Yeah, Toby Mack, Energy Equipment Infrastructure Alliance. Just doing quick math on the back of an envelope about the LNG capacity that's in the queue on the Gulf Coast, and adding up how much supply that's going to draw, and looking at the capacity of the Permian and the Haynesville supply. Doesn't seem to me that all of that gas can come from the Permian and Haynesville. Some is going to have to come from the Marcellus and Utica. And if that's the case, given the difficulty of getting the infrastructure in place, how are we going to get the gas from the Northeast to the Gulf Coast and the kinds of quantities needed by that potential capacity in the current permitting environment and the difficulty that greenfield projects, which I think it implies are going to be needed, are having getting planned and executed.
Stan, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It is getting more and more difficult to get Marcellus Utica gas down to the Gulf Coast. I mean, you're right about that. If you take a look at the Permian, there's 3 pipelines that have been FID. When I talk to the producers out there, some of them are predicting 3 more. There's several projects coming out of the Haynesville. Oklahoma Gas is still looking for a home. There's a lot of gas that moves west to east all the way to T85 that can be diverted down into the Gulf Coast too. So I don't think the Marcellus Utica gas necessarily needs to get into Texas, Louisiana, as much as it needs to get down into farther into Transco system to serve those markets there. We've got a very resilient grid now. I mean, gas can move in a lot of different directions. You know, any producer that wants to talk to me, we still have about 400 million cubic feet a day of north to south capacity on Texas gas we can sell out, and that's Marcellus Utica gas coming down. So there's probably a little bit more you could do there, but I think that's going to be the movement of gas. I think it's going to be Haynesville, Oklahoma, Barnett, Eagle Ford, and one area that's sitting there that's got declining production like crazy is the Fayetteville. And there's a lot of reserves at the Fayetteville. It's a pretty non-economic play right now. You need about 3 1/4 gas in Fayetteville, but you know, gas prices, you know, get up to that. You've got a lot of production at the Fayetteville. It's just sitting there. I mean, there's no rigs looking to get for it.
Other questions? I thought I saw Vicki Bailey. Did you have a question earlier?
Richard, I heard you on many levels. I heard your comments. I just take issue with those who say, at the end of the day, the pipeline's going to get built. I take issue with that on many levels too. It's going to take a fairly large balance sheet to do that. So once again, we get back to who pays. Who has the ability to have the convening power on this issue? Who can take lead on this issue? Take it out of the court system, because right now, it seems like the Fourth Circuit and others are leading on this issue, other than the folks in this room. We need the gas. I'm one of those that believe we need it all, but this access to energy issue, this New York issue, that is not insignificant, what comment did. So, who has the ability to lead, be an honest broker on this? Who has that ability? And I come to this issue from the LNG side, from the pipeline side, from the regulator side. So who can help me with that question? How do I go forward and have a conversation with Richard and it not get all out of hand? And you know, the rest of the community. So just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Just to answer that, I think the issue is that prior to 4 years ago, if there was a notice of intent for a large project, you would have to have a consultant that was able to navigate the Federal Register to try and figure out what the project was even before the scoping process of looking at alignments. That is not the world we live in now. And I use the Jordan Cove example, but I was sitting down with tribal members from the Klamath tribe, sitting down with individuals from the county commissioners, the environmental community, and the states, because the convening authority that resides with this council is very similar to what CEQ would do, except I'm not just worried about NEPA, I'm worried about the 56 other permits that could be attached post a record of decision to provide the end-to-end solution. And the reality here is that where we were 4 years ago is not where we are now. And there are separate eminent domain and FERC discussions that need to be had. That is not within my purview because of the ex parte nature of FERC. But the bottom line is this. In the past, regardless of whether it's a transmission project, a solar project, pump storage, a reservoir, the issues that have not been addressed are ones that are now being addressed by recognizing that if you bring all relevant stakeholders to the front end, on an environmental justice perspective, on a mitigation perspective, then you decharge the adversarial relationship that starts from the beginning where folks are pointed at each other trying to figure out how they're going to get this thing built fast enough and are already calculating 3 or 4 years of judicial review into actually putting a shovel in the ground. That's a world that we can change. And my card's over there.
So, thanks, Alex. I think that I don't have all the answers to this for sure, but I think there are a couple of very specific practical things that could happen. We talk all the time about fair and just compensation. In Nelson County alone, our little county in Virginia, the price paid for easements for a disturbed square foot on private landowners' land on the ACP has ranged from as little as 5 cents a foot to as much as $139 a foot. That's a 2,700% discrepancy between the two. And yes, there's divergent value of property in Nelson County, but it isn't that divergent, right? And so that calls into question the idea of what is fair and just. And who gets paid 5 cents are communities with few resources, with little access to counsel, with no idea how to work within the system. And the folks who get paid the most are the ones at the top of the ecosystem, right? And that's an injustice. That isn't balanced. And that happens because of this combination of quick take and eminent domain. One of the things that could happen without a policy change, Alex, although I'd love to see one, is that any of the natural gas companies building could, instead of going to the courts and asking for preliminary injunctions or quick take, they could ask for accelerated, like fast track for the court cases. Because quick take takes away a landowner's right to due process. We have no place in which to air our concerns and negotiate through in the ways in which we're guaranteed as citizens for those rights. If you instead ask, so doing that is the wrong remedy for the courts. If we need to accelerate the process of building pipelines, then fast track the court cases. Give every landowner their day in court if they choose to have it. If they don't give them the right to negotiate, that's fine. We rebalance that system in a way that I think fundamentally changes the adversarial nature of the relationship. It isn't perfect, it doesn't get rid of everything, but it's a huge step forward, and it's one that doesn't require policy. It requires ethics. And there's a question of whether or not we've got it.
Well, I mean, just to that point, just to be very clear, when I talk about the balance, I know it's a landowner, and I don't want to use pejorative language, but when it comes to two entities, the two forces, the entity that's developing financing and the rest to build a natural gas pipeline built in the benefit of the country as a whole, right? Those jobs, those for-profit companies are employing people and doing things that reduce the overall baseload requirements because they're adding new capacity. Then you have a situation where I have seen firsthand the extortive nature of compensatory mitigation where there's no reasonability on that side, where the leaseholder, or in many cases the private property owner, is not being reasonable because they have policy objections to the project. So what are you supposed to do if you're putting capital at risk, you're beholden to Wall Street, you're trying to build pipelines which are in the best interest of the country, yet no one's got your back? Because you have to go to the courts, and you don't want the courts to be adjudicating these decisions on a patchwork basis over multiple years. That's not what the program is supposed to be set up to do, and that's why policies have to be built to address that rather than going to the courts, which only reduce it and exacerbate the problem.
And yet, Alex, the idea that these are just job creators is also a bit of a question on the narrative, right? So they're speculative job creators, but for example, on my property, my business property, we were a year and a half into the development of a boutique resort that would employ 125 people in our rural community full-time, deliver millions of dollars to our county and local community. That's one 100-acre parcel on a 600-mile pipeline. How many other instances like that also exist? The entire ACP will create 273 permanent jobs. Now there's downstream effect, but there's downstream effect from every economic project. And so if the court either take it to the courts on the fast track or use the free market. you have to use the free market to get the gas out of the ground. You've got to negotiate royalty payments and other settlements with with landowners. Do the same thing on the pipeline projects, and I actually think it would be less costly and far faster to get there. If you think that the ACP says they'll save $326 million a year, and it's a 20-year project, take 4 years of that. You've got over $1 billion slush fund to buy those easements. I know a lot of people in our community who would have gladly made that deal. I think that's a different approach.
Let's leave and go to the bar. We don't have to do the rest of this.
Do you, Alex, I think the certificate policy statement by FERC is a good policy. It balances, has about a third of it to communities and landowners. And as Chairman Chatterjee says, we look at each project on an individual basis. And I take that within the context of that policy. Do you all believe up there that the certificate policy statement is encompassing enough of the arguments we're having here?
I think it is.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, if you take a look at the process, and I've been in this business for 40 years and built a lot of pipelines, and usually the process of working with the landowner starts even before I file a certificate application. I mean, it really does. If I'm going to have a problem, I want to know about it ahead of time. Oftentimes, you can accommodate people. Sometimes you just can't. But the process allows anyone to intervene during the certificate process. I do community outreach that anybody can come to. I have to notify affected landowners. They can all show up. And I guarantee you there are attorneys that will represent the bulk of them. And they do. I've had to deal with them. Truth of the matter is, on the projects that we do, very little of the right-of-way that we wind up getting has to go through the whole eminent domain process. A lot of it is obtained even before the certificate application. I'll get a right that if I get my certificate application, this is the deal. So I think the process works. There could be times, and I understand there is with you, that it doesn't work to the benefit and to the detriment of the landowner. But I think if you look at the reason that pipelines were given an eminent domain is without it, these pipelines would not get built. I tried to build a liquids pipeline going through Kentucky. Part of it was going to go through Kentucky. We abandoned it because in the state of Kentucky, it was not an interstate pipeline, it was a liquids pipeline. Didn't have the right of eminent domain. We went to the courts in Kentucky and they said, Kentucky cannot give you the rights of eminent domain. And the amount of reroutes that we had to look at because landowners just made the project uneconomic. And that's what you're going to find. They're just not going to build.
Well, thanks, Dan. I think we've just about run out of time here.